Before the first musket fired, before the ink dried on the Declaration of Independence, America was already in debt. Freedom began not with glory, but with a promise. A promise written not on parchment, but in ledgers. While patriots spoke of liberty, bankers whispered of credit. Behind every cannon blast, behind every speech about destiny, there was a quiet transaction, one that would decide whether the idea of America lived or died before it could walk. Picture it. Candlelight flickering across the faces of men in powdered wigs, gathered not in Congress, but in cramped offices in Philadelphia, Boston, and Paris. Ink-stained fingers trace shaky numbers across a page. They weren't counting soldiers. They were counting coins. The colonies could dream of independence all they wanted, but without money, those dreams would collapse before the first winter. In 1775, the British Empire was the richest and most powerful force on Earth. The colonies, by comparison, were broke. 13 scattered economies with no central treasury, no credit history, and no gold reserves. They had courage and conviction, and a cause worth dying for. But courage alone doesn't buy muskets. Conviction doesn't feed an army. The revolution needed something else, something more invisible, yet more binding than any constitution. It needed debt. Loans became muskets. Interest became ammunition. Promises became freedom. Before America could win its independence, it had to borrow it. Welcome to the history of debt, where we uncover how money has quietly shaped the rise and fall of nations. Because if liberty was bought on credit, what was the true price of America's freedom? The American Revolution began not with fireworks, but with bankruptcy. In 1775, when the Continental Congress first met, it found itself at war with an empire, but without the means to sustain it. There was no national currency, no central bank, and barely any gold or silver in circulation. The colonies had relied for decades on British credit, British merchants, and British ships. Now, in rebellion, they were cut off from all three. The Congress tried printing money, the famous Continental dollars. At first, they seemed like a clever solution, paper backed by the promise of future victory. But soon, confidence collapsed. By 1781, those dollars were worth less than the paper they were printed on. Soldiers were paid in notes that could barely buy bread. Merchants refused to accept them. "Not worth a Continental," became a bitter saying. Desperation drove the revolutionaries to seek credit abroad. Benjamin Franklin, America's philosopher ambassador, crossed the Atlantic not merely to win hearts, but to win loans. In the grand salons of Paris, under chandeliers that reflected centuries of European wealth, Franklin became a beggar for liberty. He charmed aristocrats, reasoned with ministers, and hinted at destiny. France, humiliated by its defeat in the 7 Years' War, saw an opportunity for revenge and for profit. Between 1777 and 1782, France provided the colonies with over 1.3 billion livres in loans and aid, an astronomical sum for the time. Without that French gold, Washington's army would have starved in the snow at Valley Forge, and Yorktown might never have been won. But France wasn't the only lender. The Dutch Republic, small but rich, became another crucial source of funds. Amsterdam bankers, skeptical yet intrigued, lent millions of guilders to a republic that didn't yet exist. Even Spain quietly funneled silver into the revolution, hoping to weaken Britain. Each coin carried risk. Each note carried doubt. The lenders knew that if America lost, their money was gone forever. And the borrowers, Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, and their peers, knew that every signature bound the newborn nation to a future of repayment. In 1781, the colonies found one more savior. Robert Morris, a Philadelphia merchant known as the financier of the Revolution. Using his personal credit and private fortune, Morris kept the army fed and the government solvent. He mortgaged his own properties to sustain the dream of independence. He understood something vital. That credit is confidence, and confidence can win wars. So, when the guns fell silent at Yorktown in 1781, victory was celebrated as a triumph of courage and ideals. But beneath the fireworks lay ledgers filled with obligations. The revolution had been won not only with bullets, but with bonds. The United States was free and deeply in debt. In 1783, peace came, but peace is expensive. The new republic emerged from war with a staggering financial burden, over $75 million in combined state and federal debt. To modern ears, that might seem modest, but for 13 impoverished colonies, it was a mountain. Creditors, both foreign and domestic, began to worry. Could this fragile experiment in democracy even survive long enough to repay them? The young United States teetered on the edge of insolvency. The federal government had no power to tax. It could only request funds from the states, and the states rarely complied. Veterans went unpaid. Bonds depreciated. Rebellion simmered, not against kings, but against debt collectors. In 1786, a former captain named Daniel Shays led thousands of farmers in Massachusetts in open revolt. They were veterans, men who had fought for liberty and returned home to foreclosure. They believed they had traded one oppressor for another, the creditor for the crown. The rebellion was crushed, but the message was clear. Freedom without financial stability is an illusion. Enter Alexander Hamilton, the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury and the architect of America's financial identity. Hamilton understood something his contemporaries feared to admit. Debt could be a source of strength. In his eyes, a national debt was not a curse, but a bond, literally and figuratively, that tied citizens, investors, and governments together. His plan was audacious. He proposed that the federal government assume all state debts, creating one unified national ledger. It was controversial. Why should Virginia pay for Massachusetts' loans? But Hamilton saw beyond the numbers. He saw that by honoring every obligation, America could build the most powerful currency of all. Trust. Trust that the government would pay what it owed. Trust that its promises had value. Opposing him was Thomas Jefferson, who saw debt as moral decay. To Jefferson, borrowing chained future generations to the greed of the present. He envisioned a pastoral republic of farmers, not a web of financiers and speculators. To him, Hamilton's vision smelled of monarchy, of bankers ruling where kings once did. The philosophical battle between these two men defined America's economic soul. Jefferson saw freedom in self-sufficiency. Hamilton saw freedom in confidence, and history sided with Hamilton. When the federal government assumed the debts, issued new bonds, and honored every note, something extraordinary happened. The United States, once a beggar nation, became creditworthy. Investors in London and Amsterdam began to treat American securities as reliable. Money began to flow again. Commerce revived. From the ashes of insolvency rose a new idea, that a nation SS power comes not from hoarded gold, but from the faith others place in its promises. Debt, properly managed, could become destiny. As the 19th century dawned, America began to master the art of borrowing. The same tool that once saved it from collapse became the engine of expansion. Roads carved through forests. Canals connected oceans. Steamships, factories, and telegraphs, all financed by the invisible machinery of debt. Credit became the lifeblood of progress. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, was financed largely through state-issued bonds, turning borrowed money into a 363-mile artery of commerce that transformed the nation's economy. Railroads followed, binding east to west. Each iron rail was laid not just with sweat, but with credit. Each train whistle sang the song of borrowed ambition. By the mid-1800s, debt had ceased to be a symbol of weakness. It had become a symbol of momentum. America was learning to leverage the future, to build today with tomorrow's wealth. But there was always a shadow. Every loan carried a promise to repay, and every promise carried a risk of default. The Panic of 1837, born from speculation and overborrowing, nearly shattered the young economy. Banks failed, currencies collapsed, and unemployment soared. The cycle of confidence and collapse would repeat throughout American history, from the Great Depression to the 2008 financial crisis. Yet through every crisis, the same paradox endured. Debt, though dangerous, was also essential. It allowed a small cluster of colonies to fight an empire. It built the infrastructure that turned a continent into a nation, and it financed the industries that made America a global power. Debt became not just an economic instrument, but an identity, a belief that tomorrow would always be bigger than today. When Abraham Lincoln issued greenbacks during the Civil War, he was following the same logic Franklin once used in Paris, financing survival through faith in the future. When the New Deal poured billions into public works, when the Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe, when the Federal Reserve underwrote global stability, each moment was a reflection of that same founding truth. The same loans that bought freedom also built empire. 2.5 centuries after Franklin begged for credit in Paris, the United States stands as the most indebted nation in human history, and the most powerful. Its treasury securities are the backbone of global finance. Central banks from Tokyo to Zurich hold them as the safest asset on Earth. The entire world, in a sense, has lent America its trust. But trust, like any loan, comes with interest. The colonies once borrowed to escape an empire. Now the nation borrows to sustain one. The circle is complete. The creditor has become the borrower, and the borrower has become the world's banker. Debt built America. It bought its freedom, financed its frontiers, and powered its dreams. It also demanded its price, a permanent dependence on confidence, a system where faith itself became currency. And perhaps that's the true genius, and the true danger, of the American experiment. The founders believed they were creating a republic of liberty. What they created, perhaps unknowingly, was also a republic of credit. A nation held together, not just by ideals, but by promises. Promises that must never be broken, because the moment they are, the whole illusion collapses. Maybe freedom was never free. Maybe it was financed. And maybe the story of America is not simply one of revolution and independence, but of how debt, properly wielded, can become a tool of destiny. Because behind every flag, every skyscraper, every innovation, and every act of defiance, there is still that invisible thread, stretching back to those candlelit rooms where men once risked everything they didn't go and it have, for a future they could barely imagine. If stories like this make you see history differently, don't just watch. Think, question, subscribe. Because the history of debt will keep revealing the price tag behind every revolution.